Hi, folks, and welcome back for the second presentation of the GXP Summit. And I have the pleasure to introduce James Black. James is a data science leader and epidemiologist who loves all things open source. James currently serves as a business lead at Novartis for the development of the next generation scientific computing environment. Previously, James was the director at Roche and business lead for the clinical and real-world data SCE environments. He holds a PhD in medical science from the University of Cambridge MRC Epidemiologic Unit, worked at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Science, and did his early degrees and schooling in New Zealand. James is driven by a powerful mission: continuous improvement in the efficiency, reproducibility, and democratization of how we convert data into robust insights. Please join me in welcoming James to the stage.
Cool. Thank you, Andre. So today I'd like to talk a little bit about three examples where we've seen the norms on validation redefined. But I think more importantly, there's this kind of message here to emphasize that validation is not a fixed concept. And we continuously need to kind of challenge the status quo and have a really healthy dialogue on risk versus agility within your organization. So there's some background on where I'm coming from. As Andre said, I've spent most of my career at Roche, where I've intersected with validation as a business lead on data science platforms. So that's both those in kind of the space where validation requirements are often not required. So in the PHC and kind of exploratory space, as well as within clinical reporting, where validation is central and topics like audits and inspections are expected. And then more recently, I've joined Novartis as a product owner for their new scientific computing environment. So I think to kind of put out there from the beginning that what you hear today is definitely not the industry interpretation of validation. I think like one of those Rorschach tests, people interpret it very differently. So between companies, you often see different interpretations of validation. I think one good example I had moving from Roche to Novartis was business code is validated at Novartis, whereas that concept, even though the similar process is followed, it's not considered validation if the business does it at Roche. And sometimes you see, even between departments at the same company, validation is interpreted a different way. Like if you talk to a real-world data scientist about where validation is relevant, you get a very different answer than if you talk to a statistical programmer. And then likewise, even when you're talking about roles within like a single team, people are going to be approaching it a little bit differently. And the opinions shared here today do not represent the official position of either Roche or Novartis on validation. I guess these are more my personal musings from having worked in the scientific computing environment space for the last, it's about 6 or 7 years now. So talking a bit more about these kind of personas and how they view validation. And these are kind of gross generalizations, so apologies to anyone who feels misrepresented from these summaries. But for our colleagues in quality, they're more likely to be orientated onto things like audits and inspections and being entrusted to ensure that we can maintain that trust with patients as well as regulators. So there's this focus on validation being kind of a mechanism to ensure that evidence is in place, that people were trained correctly, and that there's a specific process that's traceable that was used to take the raw data from the CRF and generate that statistic, which we use to show our drug is safe or effective. For our IT colleagues, so there's still that want to do what's right for patients, but that's where there's often these mandated processes around computerized system validation. And there's a lot of inertia that's required to try and push past these fixed processes, especially if you talk about trying to establish something that's maybe taking a risk-based approach rather than kind of a blanket policy. And then finally, from the user perspective, we often bear the brunt of the negative aspects of validation. So this is things like frozen and slow to adapt environments, and also fragmentation of platforms. I think we saw that in the last talk where they talked about different platforms for GXP. And again, data scientists still want to give the right answer and a robust and reproducible answer. But as an end user, we're often insulated from this back and forth, and we just see the restrictions on how we work. So like the example, I'm stuck using a frozen version of R packages from almost a year ago, or I'm having to kind of move between different platforms, or a statistician is using a different platform than their stats programmer. So I guess we'll need a whole talk to go over what the regulators are expecting from sponsors in terms of validation. But if I were to kind of capture what's been presented in 3 bullet points, I guess I would say that we need this infrastructure that's used to analyze the trial data to be accurate. It needs to give accurate results. We need to be able to reproduce those results end to end. And that end-to-end flow of information needs to be traceable. Like, we need to know who did what and what happened to those data points to get to that final table or plot or listing that was used to make a decision. And I'm not going to go very technical here, but there's kind of other aspects here, like things like qualification as well. Like, was the system installed correctly and was it tested and things like that. And then if we think about the business code, because kind of on top of this informatics infrastructure, there's also code written by our statisticians and our statistical programmers. It is software, even if we're not always following kind of normal software development processes. And there, again, trying to summarize, there's maybe a slight difference in our priorities, but we're really focusing on, does this do what we say it will do? Is it accurate? Is the documentation good so that people use it responsibly and in the correct way? And is there testing present? So for instance, like in an R package, do they have unit tests using test stat? There are some good resources to kind of understand how the industry as a whole is summarizing these topics. So Fuse has an FCE white paper, which is available via their website. And then dropping down a level to the business code, the R Validation Hub, this is specific to R, but they've done a white paper. And I think it's important to note that, if we're talking about business code, there's going to be SAS macros, potentially there's Python code. Like, it's not just R, but this is a great resource for approaching kind of business-owned code bases and the topic of validation. So in terms of like tackling those myths, I wanted to kind of highlight 3 examples where I think over the last kind of 5 years, I've seen that be the status quo and the expectation, and then different groups tackle it and kind of redefine what's required. So for the first example is this idea that it's very difficult or impossible to have GXP coexist in the same computing platform as your exploratory work. Another topic is validation leads to long environment release cycles. So, this is that I have a frozen environment, we only update it every 6 months or every year because that process of validation takes so long. And then also one which I hope is, at least for this audience, is I'm preaching to the choir, this is no longer true, but we can't use open source in a GXP context. So for the first topic, I'll reference it back to a talk that I gave while I was at Roche, which highlighted our attempt to implement risk-based validation on the SCE so that we could kind of move GXP and exploratory into the same platform, but still be able to kind of robustly validate those TLFs that would go to regulators. And so this was, the core of this is to isolate out the no human involved production runs. So, making sure we can have that traceability on an output, knowing that exactly what versions of code were used, what versions of data was used, who triggered it, and things like that. So this is essentially the prod run will be validated, but not the rest of the workflow. And so breaking that down into something that's a little bit more tangible. So an example of that would be in a kind of a traditional setup where we have separate environments, would have our planned deliverables, we would have a very frozen and restricted platform. So this is one where, updates once every 6 months, once every year. Sometimes, like historically with SaaS platforms, it's even less frequent. And all of the work kind of preparing for that final batch run that creates the production outputs is done within this one platform. And then we do our prod run, we generate our deliverables, and that is a validated process. But I think the key thing here is that the entire process of getting to the point of clicking run on a prod run is part of one GXP platform. But then we run into these issues where, like exploratory analysis or secondary analysis, they can't work in these frozen environments. They need new packages, they need non-validated packages. And so we often end up having two separate SCEs. Often the second SCE, I've seen across a few companies, is essentially a bunch of POSIT products strung together. But I think the general idea here is that it's a much more kind of fluid platform. So people are able to install additional unvalidated packages. There may still be the ability to do prod runs, but you could also, for instance, trigger things from GitHub or GitLab code bases, or you could even be doing interactive runs. So you could be interactively running code and looking at that output. And then also this is often where the Shiny apps and the other kind of application type code is deployed from. And so what we wanted to tackle in that talk I gave while I was at Roche was how can we move away from that to have one SCE, but isolate out the parts that needed to be kind of controlled and validated. So if we do kind of get alignment with our quality organizations that what they care about is the final production run of how a data point flowed through to that piece of information that went into a CSR, then we no longer need to validate the entire process. So in this particular example, we can have one platform where people can do their kind of code development. So essentially anything interactive is happening here. And they could be using a frozen container. So they could say, hey, I would like to make sure I can use the exact same container later, but they don't have to. And it allows people to kind of work in one place while they're interactive. And then we focus just on that kind of non-interactive batch run as the piece that we validate. And so that kind of gives us that flexibility where from one scientific computing environment, we can allow a lot of flexibility, knowing that we can isolate out just those production runs and restrict their ability to pull in different packages and things like that, or versions of R, making sure that that result is reproducible. And I think one thing which was on the original slide was also capturing that metadata. So we have that traceability of who ran it, what code was used to generate the output, which version of the data was used, and things like that. So one of the other kind of myths I wanted to talk about was these long environment release cycles. So I originally wanted to talk about on the computing side, like on the infrastructure side, tackling the long environment release cycles, but that's a much more complicated topic. So I think from the last talk, they were talking about infrastructure as code. And if you are able to kind of automate as much of the testing as possible, I think some of that carries over. But for this example, I'll talk about the much simpler case of, well, how can we move away from these snapshotted R environments? So to give an example, what you kind of often see in companies is that they'll say, okay, every 6 months or every 12 months, we're going to release like a frozen version of R along with all of the packages. And often these are kind of actually baked in to that particular environment. So it's not like they're using CRAN or an internal CRAN or package manager. They're actually like installing the packages into this environment. And I think I can talk about a tool that doesn't exist anymore, but like Validar that used to come from Mango. That was an example where you're kind of like baking in all of the packages on a particular snapshot. So the problem, so as I mentioned before, you're kind of going off the CRAN, you may be taking some internal packages, you're putting them through some validation process, which may be internal or external, and then you're getting back this kind of bundle, which is kind of a hermetically sealed environment, which then becomes your release for that particular 6-month or 12-month period. Where that becomes a bit of a problem is where you may have a study team pop up and they say, hey, we really need to use an updated version of this package, or we need to use a whole new package that's not part of your bundle. And then so often you have to kind of do this as almost like an exception. Because, if you go back and you want to update any of the existing packages, you've now changed the environment. So you kind of usually have to do things at a study level where you have some exception process to allow that particular package update to be used for that particular study. And so this is kind of messy and not the greatest workflow. And I think it's something we see a lot as more and more open source studies are done, because the pace of packages changing and functionality coming out. So for instance, if you think about a Pharmaverse package, in the space of 6 months, they can change quite dramatically. And you'll often have teams that want to use that new functionality, or even are required to, because there's things they need that didn't exist in the snapshotted version. So going back to the diversity present between companies, I think one good resource on how people are approaching these kind of business code package environments is the R Validation Hub website. So if you go there, there's one of the menu items is case studies. And then if you click on case studies, inside the case studies, you'll see a whole bunch of examples from different companies of how they do it. So it's interesting to see how they're doing it, but it's also interesting to see what are the differences between the companies. But I wanted to pick on one here in particular. That was the work of Colleen, Doug, Simone, and Lorenzo, because they challenged this stance that we need to kind of snapshot the code. And they moved to a model which was actually kind of a fluid, continuously updating validated environment. And so if you go to that slide deck, it's actually only a few bullet points, but kind of digging into some of the other presentations that Doug has given before at places like the R Pharma roundtables. You can see that what they've done is they've decoupled the packages themselves from the environment. So in this particular example, that date, saying the 1st of October, that's pointing to a snapshot on a package manager or any CRAN-like repository that allows snapshotting. And so the idea then is that you do bake in your kind of system dependencies, but you don't bake in the particular cohort of R packages being used. And instead you start with a pointer. So you say, hey, by default, I want you to use the October 2023 cohort with the October 2023 image, but you don't actually bake it into the container. So that kind of simplifies things. If someone comes along and says, hey, I've got a brand new package, or I really need to use an updated version of that particular package, because you can tell them, okay, well, great, submit it to the package manager and our team will validate it, but they'll validate it against the cohort. So they'll essentially do like an iterative release, taking that new version of the package and any other packages that have updated in that time, and they can kind of re-release a snapshot that has been updated to include that particular package. Which then means, for instance, if this new updated package or the package was available in by the 1st of November, as long as they put a date after that, and then they use the kind of built-in tooling within RM, they're able to upgrade their particular study or clinical reporting activity to the latest version of that cohort within the validated repository. And I think this is a really cool example where, it was almost a standard that we would have these long environment release cycles, and people complaining because they're on very, very old versions of particular packages and things like that. This essentially solves that problem and allows people to be much more fluid in terms of being able to kind of walk their study to a future version of the package cohorts without having to do something drastic like start again on a different container. And so I think the last one is one where, as I think I mentioned before, I hope I'm preaching to the choir that this is no longer an issue, but I think it's just to reiterate that it wasn't that long ago there was a lot of concern about using open source in a submission or GXP content. And I think one thing which is really interesting to look at is this repository that Phil Belcher maintains. So if you go to GitHub and look up, just type in Phil Belcher as a user, you'll see he has this repository where he's gone through all the new drug applications and essentially pulled out any reference to R. He's also done this to Python, but it's a much smaller list. But I think, if you look back through the different applications he's pulled out, things like R have been around for a long time in PK, and then they're increasingly being used across different contexts in clinical reporting. So while there's a lot of hype at the moment, some of those references go back to 2012, where there's documented examples where they say this was done in R X.X. And I think it's important to acknowledge that we've actually been submitting results generated in R for at least 10 years now. There's some other great work that's happening with the R consortium. So they're working on a whole bunch of different working groups and pilots, and this is a direct collaboration with the FDA. So there's some really great work there, kind of understanding how can we actually improve the process. And so there have been some examples there where the ability to submit things has improved because they've identified gaps. So an example was we used to have to use package light, and then there's some work to get an R package past the submission portal. And then there's been some work to actually allow us to submit these kind of internal R packages directly to the FDA. And then recently, there's also been a lot of examples of companies, well, there's been at least 2 examples of companies actually going end-to-end in R. So last year, Novo Nordisk gave a really fantastic presentation. If you put in Novo Nordisk journey to an R-based FDA submission in YouTube, you'll get their webinar where they talk about the process they went through. And then roughly, well, actually just a few months ago, Roche also did the same thing. So that's again on YouTube, an example of the Roche's recent filing, which was using actually the Pharmaverse R packages mostly end-to-end in a submission. So I think this is one where, 5-6 years ago, there was still a lot of doubt across our industry, but we can quite confidently say now that we are able to do submissions using open source languages. So if we kind of go back to those initial 3 myths that I shared, there was the one around we need to separate exploratory and GXP platforms. And if we look at some of those examples, like Roche's Ocean, that is definitely not true anymore. Like we are able to put the exploratory environment and the GXP environment side by side, but then isolate out the bits which are relevant for GXP purposes. I talked a little bit about validation leads to environment release cycles. At least on the business code side, I think this is not true anymore, and we have examples of companies doing that. I think one thing I would like to see more is examples of companies doing this on the infrastructure side. So when we talk about actually working with IT on how we can release RSCE more frequently. But I think that's somewhere where maybe there's a little bit more work to do, but it's definitely, there's things that can carry over from the business code that are also relevant when we talk about the company's actual IT infrastructure that powers the scientific computing environment. And then that last one is, I think we can definitely say we can use open source in a submission and for GXP content. So yeah, I think the theme of my talk was definitely that there's a lot of variation in how people view validation, and I think that's a good thing. Validation is an evolving term, and we have this variation across companies, within companies, and across different roles within teams. But I think one of the really important things is that we keep pushing this risk-based approach. So there'll always be this balance against risk and agility. Sometimes we might go too far to agility and we'll course correct, but I think the most important thing is that we need to keep having that conversation because there is no correct answer. But I think from the platforms I've been involved in the past, there's always a way to do things a little bit better and a little bit more efficiently. And it's kind of worth that slog of working through how we can structure that in a way where we are meeting our requirements to the regulators and to the patients, but also simplifying their processes and allowing us to be more agile and efficient. Yeah. So thank you. I thought that was a 20-minute talk, but I think I've flown through it 5 minutes early, but definitely happy to take any questions. I'm seeing a lot of comments. Am I muted or is Andre muted for the backstage people? Okay, cool. So I can read the question if Andre's muted.
Yeah,
but
sorry,
do you use common
James.
brand checks? Sorry, he's back.
Yeah. So we have this comment from Leonard. Do you use common CRAN checks for validation of packaging in the fixed containerized version, or do you use any alternative checks? Yeah,
I mean, when you say you, I'm not 100% sure which to reply from, because I gave an example that had been talked about from Roche, but I'm at Novartis now. But I think absolutely from the examples I've seen, having read the case studies on the R Validation Hub website, I think everybody is using the existing tests that are present. I think, I can't remember off the top of my head, but I think they're all requiring the CRAN checks to pass. At least, notes fine, but no warnings. But I'm not 100% sure if that's true across all companies. And yes, definitely into a fixed environment. So there's some great work happening with the R Validation Hub where they're trying to think of like this golden image, but we're not going to be able to take a golden image and deploy it at every company. Like, just to give an example, I know the operating system used at Roche is different. Like the one that's used inside the containers is different than the one I've seen in my new company. So you can't just take a golden image and apply it, but you would be taking it and applying it on your company's specific images. And one company might be Red Hat, and they have their own kind of internal extensions, or they may have done hardening on it. Another company might be CentOS, another company might be Debian, another company Ubuntu. So yeah, you do need to do that, but it needs to be the actual environment you have internally for it to be valid.
Thank you. And although that golden image, as you said, may not use the same operating system, the way to build it might be a standard across the industry, so that it is common across companies. We have a different question by Patrick, and I'm going to read. Why is the release and validation cycle just checking an R package manager reference so much quicker than one that includes an entire container? Where is the overhead outside of R packages coming from?
Yeah, so I guess when I talked about the baking, so this was like that idea that when you actually define your container, you've pre-installed the packages. So like it's already got 300 or 400 packages available inside the container. Or you pointed at a library where those are pre-installed, like an external folder. I think that kind of locks you a bit, because if you then want to change the packages, you've got less flexibility. So I think the package manager, and so the one I've seen used a lot is POSIT Package Manager. So you can just pick a different snapshot, but they can also go and browse. So if somebody says, oh, I really need to use a particular version of MMRM, like I need some functionality that only exists in that version, they can go to POSIT Package Manager. They can like click on the package and they can check, okay, what was the date this was released? And they can say, okay, cool, I need to take a snapshot that's after that particular date. So there's also this whole GUI element that just makes navigating different cohorts of packages much easier. But in terms of quicker, it's not quicker, because if you've baked them, then you don't need to install anything. Like they're there. So the one caveat here is that process I was talking about, you actually need to install the packages to start working. There are some stuff you can do with caching. So reinf allows a global cache. So you can kind of actually, the user thinks they're installing them from package manager, but really they're sideloading them. But yeah, it's out of the box, it's not quicker. It's actually slower, but it gives you a lot. It means you have to wait 6 minutes or something for packages to install, but it's also much more agile.
Okay, thank you, James. We are out of time for questions. There's still one in chat, but maybe that can be addressed after your presentation. And thank you so much for such an insightful and thought-provoking talk. So I invite everyone to give a round of applause to James, and we'll be right back with our rec.